So welcome to the second day of our third edition of the research seminars on the origins of contemporary philosophy. Today we have in our schedule 5 graduate students presentations, and each student will have 30 minutes to present their conferences, which will be followed by a 15 minutes question session. So the first of them is our very special guest, Brenda Soares, who is a PhD student here at PUC São Paulo, and she'll present a conference on the Perceptual Noema by Aron Gurwitsch. So Brenda, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And do you all can see the slide?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not gonna use my whole time as usual because I'm speaking too quickly, but let's start. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and it's a pleasure to be at the third research seminars on the origins of contemporary philosophy. My intention today is to start to present the interpretation of Husserlian Noema by the phenomenologist Aron Gurwitsch, the so-called Perceptual Noema. To do this, I will divide my talk into 3 parts. In the first one, I will explain how Husserl presents his notion of Noema and the role that the Noema plays in his phenomenology. In the second, I will inform you that there is a debate involving this notion and explain the role of Gurwitsch in this debate. And finally, I will start to describe what the Perceptual Noema consists of in Aron Gurwitsch's interpretation. Let's start comparing the description of the intentional experience in 2 works, Logical Investigations and Ideas. In Logical Investigations, Husserl divides the intentional experience into 4 moments: objectuality, matter, quality, presentative contents. First, we have objectuality, which is the direction towards the intentional object. This is a very important factor because in Logical Investigations, Husserl believed that we do not have any kind of access to the intentional object to describe it. That's why the only thing we could access would be the direction to the intentional object, and that's why the description of the intentional experience focuses on how we address the intentional object. Following this logic, matter would be what we are addressing. Since we do not have immediate access to the intentional object, matter tells us what object and how it's given. Matter specifies which object I am addressing and in what way. Whenever we approach the intentional object, we do so in a specific way. We can perceive it, remember, or imagine, and we call how we do that quality. Presentative content is the element of a sensitive, non-intentional nature that can function as a basis for intentional acts. When Husserl published his ideas in 1913, we have a fundamental difference, the transcendental reduction. Because if before the intentional object was not part of the phenomenological description, with the transcendental reduction, this description is extant, and now we have access to it, but just in a certain aspect of it, because the intentional object always presents itself in a certain way. That's why Napoleon could be just as much the victor at Jena as the defeat at Waterloo. So, when Husserl goes to describe the intentional experience, he presents a new scheme. We still have a subjective part as it was in Logical Investigations, now with the divisions in 2 moments. We have again an unintentional moment that serves as a basis for the intentional moment. The first consists of sensitive and therefore non-intentional material data. They are devoid of meaning and therefore need a second moment, this one intentional, that animates the sensitive data by giving them meaning. So what happens is that sensitive data, electric data, serve as a material substrate for the intentional moment of a sense given, called by Husserl the noetic moment, or noes. And this is one of the main aspects of Russellian intentionality. The way we address the world is through the donation of meaning. But now we have something new. Parallel to the subject pole, that is noesis, there is access to meaning through the object pole of this correlation, the noematic pole. From the transcendental reduction, we have access to the objective meaning of the intentional object, which is the noema. So now, not only do we have some changes in the description of the subjective or noetic part, but also we have, in addition to that, an access to the objective correlate, which is the noema. Now, what exactly is the noema? I'm afraid there is no easy answer. What we can be sure of so far is that the noema is not an intentional object taken in its simple form, but the object sense that we have access to after the transcendental reduction. Now, the second part, the debate. The Russellian noema is not an easily defined notion. This is mainly because the way in which a single theory, in this case the theory of intentionality, is developed by Husserl in an attempt to account for spheres such as language and perception. Precisely for this reason, it can be said that even today there is a debate about its interpretation that goes back to the first work by Aron Gurwitsch in 1929, which is my focus of study. Aron Gurwicz's proposal was not only the first to be publicly expressed, but perhaps the most original reading. Since then, it has been necessary to debate and try to refute, directly or indirectly, Gurwicz's proposal. And this certainly was and has been systematically done by names such as Folesdal in 1969, Solomon in 1972, Dayfrios also in 1972, and by more recent names like Drummond, who has papers that go back from 1978 to the present day. A bibliography on the subject was made by Kersey, who noted that at the time of 1983, there are already 104 English papers concerning this debate. So we can assume that this number is so much higher given the diversity of languages that are not foreseen, and since 20 years have passed since this survey. It's not my objective to defend that Aron Gurwitsch is absolutely right in his interpretation, but to explain the pioneer spirit, relevance, and pertinence of his proposal, which, as a story and extensive debates attest, cannot be ignored. Although, as already mentioned, the debate is extensive, I will only comment in a short way on the first part of it, because I will limit myself to exposing Gurwicz's point of view in 1929, even though his most prominent work, Field of Consciousness, was published in 1955. And even after this work, Gurwitsch would dedicate himself for many years to his interpretation of the noema, and would develop other aspects that go beyond the perceptual noema, and would deal with conceptual and categorical issues that should be considered later, but that do not fit in the scope that I'm developing now. The poles of this debate generally are Gurwitsch and his perceptual noema on the one side, and Folesdal noema as a sense on the other. It's important to say that Gurwitsch and Folesdal never directly debate. After Gurwicz's interpretation was published, Folesdal published a paper in 1969 in which he expounded 12 theses on the noema, which, without mentioning Gurwicz's name, tried to refute the previous interpretation. Folesdal's foundational thesis is that the noema is intentional with an S entity, a generalization of the notion of meaning in a linguistic way. Here, Folesdal's affiliation with a linguistic interpretation of Husserl's phenomenology becomes clear due to this connection with Frege's position, which has a recognized role and his influence on Husserl. According to Folesdal, the noema is an abstract entity, in virtue of which an act of perception is directed toward its object. The noema itself is never essentially given, but it's entertaining a special act of reflection called the phenomenological reduction. Here we have two problems regarding the position that would refute Gurwitsch. As we mentioned, Husserl's theory of intentionality is not limited to the language, but also encompasses perception, and Husserl quotes this explicitly. Each perception, for example, has its noema at the lowest level, its perceptual sense, for example, the perceived as such. The second is what Folesdal means by sensualist given, because Gurwitsch has another idea of sensation that does not correspond to of Husserl or Frege, which is for consequence the same for Folesdal. Another side of this second issue that is implicitly problematic about this thesis concerns what Folesdal means by abstract entity. Because if what's at stake here is the unreality of the noema, that's fine. Gurwitsch also agree with this. As you can see from this quote, in our inquiry, we are no longer concerned with objects, but instead we are concerned with what remains of them as residuum of the epoche. Transcendent entities as such fall to the epoche, and only united multiplicities of sense remain. Phenomenological investigation is directed to those sense and is so directed in the attitude of reflection. So now, not only do we have some change, in our inquiry, we are no longer concerned with objects, but instead we are concerned with what remains of them as residuum of the epoche. Transcendent entities as such fall to the epoche, and only united multiplicities of sense remain. Phenomenological investigation is direct to the sense and so direct in the attitude of reflection. Gurwitz's earliest work addressed perceptual experience. The question becomes for Gurwitsch how we access this sense through perception. He explores a part of the theory that Husserl don't develop at the time. Freud, aware of the difference and despite developing his own criticisms, recognized that Gurwitz's work was underestimated for a long time. In 1972, he exposed how Gurwitz's work is innovative and has been underestimated by several other authors on the problem and sees the undeniable influence that exists in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology. But after all, what is the noema for Gurwitsch? Or rather, what is the perceptual noema for Gurwitsch? We must remember the resilient scheme that we show at the beginning and expose the adaptations made by Gurwitsch. So, before we had a noetic moment, donation of meaning to healing, and the objective correlate the noema. But Gurwitsch proposed some changes. In his new scheme, there is no healing. There is only a noematic correlation that characterizes the intentionality. So, we need to know why there is no longer a healing and how this changes the way we understand perceptual experience, and finally, what role this change plays in Gurwitz's interpretation of perceptual noema. The presence of a healing is what Gurwitsch will call the doctrine of dialectic, and is one of the elements that he believes that needs to be revised in Russellian phenomenology. This doctrine assumes the possibility of separation between matter and form. In this context, the matter gains meaning from a donation that characterizes one of the moments of intentionality. The idea of a constant healing that depends on a donation of meaning is interpreted by Gurwitsch as an inheritance of a presupposition of classical psychology, the constancy hypothesis. That is, the idea that there is a constant connection between stimulus and sensation. For Gurwitsch, we must refute the idea of healing. Acts of consciousness as well as psychological events do not consist of two strata, a healing and morphe. A separation like this is not even abstractly possible, since disregarding the morphe and focus only on the healing implies a change in what is given. And the basis of phenomenology is to access and describe what is given. That's the point. What is, in every case, the given? For Gurwitsch, we can begin to answer this question through a phenomenology of perception, and for that he relies on the development of Gestalt theory. It turns out that in 1913, the year that Husserl published Ideas, another publication also appears. Kohler publishes an article questioning for the first time the constant hypothesis based on the results of experiments in Gestalt theory developed by the Berlin School. So, Gurwitsch has access to these two publications and in a critical and pioneering way makes the first phenomenological interpretation of Gestalt theory in his 1929 publication, which is also the first interpretation of the Russellian Noema. These two ideas are intrinsically connected. Now, what does this change in the Noes influence the interpretation of the Noema? From this change, consonance is in its noetic moment does not give a meaning to morphosensorial data, but has access to a meaning incorporated in them through the correlation between the acts of consonance and the noematic sphere of meaning, which goes in the same direction as defended by Gestalt theory, that we do not have access to anything without form or configuration. We always have access to the phenomenon that already has a meaning, which is the result of the organization of its parts into a totality and of our relationship with it. What Gurwitsch seeks to do in his thesis is to phenomenologically describe our access to what is perceived as such, or the perceptual noema, as a noematic stratum, that is, our access to sense. Because a perception of a thing is a perception through which the thing presents itself in this, rather than another manner of adumbration appearance. The interest in Gestalt theory is how a system of a meaning and adumbrations organize itself internally, and we have several levels of this system. For example, the system of adumbrations of intentional object is part of the system of meanings of the noema, which corresponds to the system of concatenated acts of consciousness. And although we always perceive the system from a certain point of view, we perceive it as a totality, because what is seen, what is really presented, falls with the domain of what is not seen, and is more or less undetermined in certain dimensions. And this domain necessarily belongs to what presents itself in the mode of originality. But the very nature of adumbration, what genuinely appears, is surrounded by what is not really present, and even empty and indeterminate components belong there. It is the same for the sphere of meaning or sense. There is not just one meaning, one noema. The noema itself is a system of sense that corresponds to a system of adumbration, and that is why Gurwitsch says, from the fact that a plurality of meanings can refer to the same object, it follows that none of the meanings coincides with the object. There is always a multiplicity, but this multiplicity is not the opposite of unity, identity, and organization. What I would like to make explicit here is the innovation of Aron Gurwicz's work. When Husserl opposes the naturalistic psychology of his time, he is still reacting to the problem. What Gurwitsch does, with the help of Gestalt, is change the problem, because he has access to another psychology and another type of perceptual experience. For him, if we take the transcendental reduction from the point of view of this new problem, there is no reason to have a healing. The perception of the intentional object is already mediated by the way it presents itself to us. The perceptual noema is a moment, maybe a starting point. in the perceptual updating of meaning that we are engaged in due to the noetic correlation. When someone says, well, but that's not what Husserl was trying to say in ideas, my answer would be, of course not. That's the innovation part. As I said at the beginning, my intention is not to prove that Gurwitsch is completely right, but to show the pertinence of his proposal. To finish, in a biographical sketch of Aron Gurwitsch presenting his collected papers, there is a story that once Husserl told Gurwitsch, well, perhaps you see further than I do because you stand on my shoulders. Even if Gurwitsch admits later that he was never able to convince Husserl that the doctrine of Leckie data contains a version of the constance hypothesis. But if Husserl himself can give the benefit of the doubt, how can we not? Thank you very much.
So thank you, Brenda, for the great presentation. We'll now open to the question session. And let me just introduce the other participants. So first of all, I would like to know if anyone here in the StreamYard room has any questions. Okay. So does anyone from the audience have any question? Okay.
I don't know if it's a good or bad thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think our theme is hard enough. So if no one has any questions, yeah, perhaps we can go forward. So, okay. I would like now to call here Julia, for her presentation. Yeah, you're the second one, right? Yeah.
Sorry, I thought I was.
You were not prepared? Okay.
Okay, sorry, I'm not prepared.
Okay, but I have your presentation here in my computer.
Yeah, but I just had to check my notes. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So. Oh, sorry.
No problem. Border, if you want.
Thank you.
So, just try to do something. Slides. Okay, what things? Okay. So, if you want to go through the slides, you just tap here. Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Thank you. So, that's not. Okay.
Yeah, it is working.
Okay. So, first, I want to thank you for the opportunity to join this workshop and to give a presentation here again. What I want to talk about today is some kind of a very old project of mine. So, before I started my research in the philosophy of Schlick, I think about 6 or 7 years ago, what I was talking about in September, I was reading Thomas Kuhn, and started to read Imre Lakatos. Then I started my research on Schlick and put this all away for several years. And so now that I finished my PhD thesis, I thought I maybe could start working especially on Lakatos' theory again. And in the last weeks, I just looked up my old notes and restarted to think about this work. And so for now, I don't have a big thesis. I just want to introduce you into my thoughts on the theories of Kuhn and Lakatos. So at first, I want to talk about why I have been interested in Kuhn's theory at all. Then I'm going to give a very short introduction to the parts of the so-called thesis of structure that are, in my mind, important for my thoughts. So afterwards, I am going to talk about the, in my opinion, most striking problems in Kuhn's theory, and finally introduce you into my interpretation of a very small part of the work of Lakatos. At the end, I hope that I can manage to make it understandable why I think that research on Lakatos could be interesting. So, why I was interested in Kuhn's theories. Since I was working as a teacher, I felt very hard that in school, normally we do just get up a finished up package of what we call science. So, but later on, we hopefully recognize that there is something more about it. And then maybe we ask ourselves the question, how does science work? Mostly in philosophy, as you all know, we prefer the German language. We say that it was clearer, differentiates better, and so on. But in this special case, when I ask, how does science work? I really do prefer the English language. In German, we would probably ask something like, wie funktioniert Wissenschaft? What means something like, how does science function? But in English, we ask, how does science work? And this formulation implies one really important aspect of science. So working is a verb that implies a process, which is not a static view. One might also say that science is always work in progress. So to lay the focus onto this aspect of the constitution of scientific theories, onto the human part of it, is for me the most important part of Kuhn's essay on the structure of scientific revolutions. So first, what are paradigms in Kuhn's theory and how do they change? So the structure of scientific revolutions implies a phasic succession of different stages in the course of scientific development. So first, we have a pre-scientific phase. Kuhn calls it pre-paradigmatic. The use of the prefix pre shows that in this stadium, we don't have established as science as such. In this stadium, a field of knowledge only defines itself by family resemblances. These resemblances exist between different schools of scientists who are dealing with the same kind of natural phenomena, but interpret them in different ways. Those different schools arise their theories from different premises, from which they derive different complexes of theoretical and methodological beliefs that constitute a paradigm. So when this phase is once coming to an end, one of the schools can prevail over the others. We get to the phase of normal science. In this stadium of science, all the scientists work under the sign of the same common paradigm. It's the phase of normal scientific research. Then, somewhere it must happen that anomalies accumulate. The science is getting to a point where the common paradigm is not able anymore to explain all the natural phenomena satisfactorily, due to a too large number of anomalies. The science is falling into a crisis. And so, while the stadium of crisis, the general conditions of the science remains of the pre-paradigmatic phase. We have different schools with different solutions that stand in competition to each other. And so finally it comes to a change. Again, one of the schools can prevail, a new paradigm for the science arises. We go back to a new phase of normal science, but now under the sign of a new paradigm. This change of paradigms, the succession of different paradigms after each other, Kuhn calls the process of scientific revolutions. So, as you can see, after the first emerge of a scientific paradigm that unites all the scientists under itself, and in this way makes scientific research possible, the science underlies a development history in the way I just described. It somehow, as you can see, resembles a circle. If a science has once emerged a paradigm, it is not giving it up until the science falls into a crisis. In the crisis, a new paradigm arises that seems to be better alternative to the old one, and it comes to a change of paradigm. Afterwards, we get into a new phase of normal science until the science falls into the next crisis and the history repeats itself. So, what is a paradigm that stands in the center of this process? Etymologically, the Olden Greek subject paradigma means example, model, or sample. As a verb, paradigmumi means to show or to give an example. So, what is it that a model gives us in science? At this point, I want to answer with a suggestion. It is somehow showing us what nature might be, or has to show us what nature might be. And here arises the problematic relationship between the nature and the paradigma. Science, like Kuhn says, is trying to analyze natural phenomena, the nature itself. But instead of this, science actually is articulating its own paradigm. That itself is just referring to nature and nothing more. In front of this background, Kuhn differentiates two different meanings of paradigm in his own theory. First, paradigms as disciplinary matrices. As a disciplinary matrix, Kuhn defines, as you can read here, the entire constellation of beliefs, values, techniques, and so on, shared by the members of a given community. The second meaning of paradigm for Kuhn is in the sense of exemplars. He says that this is one sort of element in that constellation, the concrete puzzle solutions which, employed as models or examples, can replace explicit rules as a basis for the solution of the remaining puzzles of normal sciences. But from my special interest, the exemplars are not that relevant, so when I'm going to talk about paradigms, I am talking only about disciplinary matrices in the sense I described. In the face of normal science, the paradigm is used to explain the natural phenomena with which the field of science is dealing. So the paradigm emerged because in the face of crisis, it was found that it was able to give the best explanation for the question phenomena compared to all the other paradigms that were suggested by other schools. But this does not mean that the leading paradigm that prevailed itself is able to give a satisfactory explanation for all existing phenomena of the field. It doesn't even have to be the best possible solution. It is just the best known solution for the questions the science has to deal with at that time. So it just has to give a satisfactory answer to the anomalies that make the science fall into crisis and to be new and open enough to deliver unsolved problems to a number of scientists. All this doesn't seem to throw a positive light on science. It sounds as if science was somehow a dogmatic, nearby religious thing, and that scientists are not trustworthy persons. But I think this is not what Kuhn wants to say. He states that a complex of theoretical and methodological beliefs under that scientific research happens is the only thing that makes it possible to even talk about scientific facts. In this sense, for Kuhn, the dogmatic application is a necessary condition for any scientific development. Without making premises from that derives a paradigm, science would not be more than a putting together random facts without any connection to each other. So a paradigm is necessary to allow scientific research as a systematic reconstruction of natural phenomena. So this was a really short overview about Kuhn's theory. I didn't talk about many things because like incommensurability, for example, because for what I'm going to talk about now, it's not that important. So what I like about Kuhn's theory is that, as I told you at the beginning, it's a theory that gives space and has respect to the human part of scientific research first, and second, it has respect to the fact that science is something like work in progress. So third, it is trying to give an explanation what happened when the Newtonian physics came into a crisis around 1900 and what happened when Einstein's relativistic theory, for example, took its place. But on the other hand, Kunns theory has a lot of problems. There are two of them that I think are most striking. So first, Kunns theory is a theory. This leads us to the big problem of all relativistic theories. Isn't it self-referential, and how should that work? Second, his relativistic theory is relativistic. From this point of view, we give up the belief in scientific objectivity. We scientifically undermine the science itself. And this is not something that I could live with. So Kuhn himself tried to give answers to these problems, but I really don't think that his suggested solutions can solve the problems that arise from his theory. But I think that Imre Lakatos has found a solution for this. And so what he is doing is to try to connect Kuhn's theory of scientific revolutions with Popper's falsificationism. Starting from Popper's conception, he connects a so-called refined falsificationism with scientific research programs instead of Kuhn's paradigms. What derives from this, in my view, gives us a pretty good picture of how scientific research might have developed in history. Likewise, Kuhn tried it to reconstruct, but without giving up the entitlement of science to objectivity and without falling into relativism. This works with Lakatos' explanation of a hardcore that exists in every science and that is growing with every new established theory. So the problems that Lakatos sees in Kuhn's theory, I add them to the problems that I was just talking about. So the problem he sees is that Kuhn opposes Popper's complete research program because he oversaw the refined falsificationism. Though Lakatos states, Kuhn excludes from his own theory any possibility for a rational reconstruction of scientific development. This leads to the consequence that from the Kuhnian point of view, we can never have a logic of research, only a psychology of science. So, but it's not that Lakatos' aim, I think, to totally deconstruct Kuhn's whole theory. He is trying to reconstruct it by implementing some elements of Popper so that he can rationally and logically reconstruct the process that Kuhn sees in the history of science. So Lakatos also uses Kuhnian vocabulary. He is sometimes talking about scientific revolutions. But for him, such a revolution is not a rejection of one theory by a complete new one that has nothing to do with it. For Lakatos, the revolutionary act in establishing a new theory is not rejection, but overtaking. So how does that work, and what is a refined falsificationism? Lakatos reconstructs it logically. For the refined falsificationism, a theory T is falsificated if and only if, first, a new theory T prime has an excess of content compared to T, which means that the new T theory has to deliver new facts that T couldn't. Second, the new theory T explains why T has been successful, which means that the not falsificated content of T is included in the new theory. And third, at least some part of the excess content that the new theory has compared to T has to be proven. And from this point, Lakatos' construction of scientific research programs is starting. So imagine a science that is developing. Every scientific theory T has a hardcore of facts that cannot get attacked by modus tollens. Around that hardcore, there exists a protective belt consisting of auxiliary hypotheses that can be attacked by modus tollens. If a new theory is to replace T, it has to follow the rules of refined falsificationism. T has to implement the hardcore, the new theory has to implement the hardcore of T, plus it has to expand it with at least some hypothesis of the protective belt of T. So the new theory T, on the one hand, accesses the hardcore of T with its own hypothesis. It verifies some of them, while at the same time it falsificates some other hypothesis of T's belt. At least it adds a new protective belt with its own hypothesis. In this way, the theory T is not really lost and gone forever. It is partly contained in the new theory, and with some of its now verified hypotheses, it was able to put some content to the hardcore of the science as a whole. So I once, years ago, tried to explain Lakatos' theory with the following slightly logical example. So imagine theory T has a hardcore consisting of the thesis P and a protective belt that helps the thesis Q. So the theory T states that P and maybe Q, but only Q is allowed to be attacked by modus tollens. So if we state that not P and Q, then we have to reject Q. So maybe later the protective belt of T is growing. We consider that P and maybe are necessary Q or R. And then there is coming up a new theory that states everything that is contained in the hardcore of T, so P, and it adds that not Q and R. Additionally, it adds S. So we are not sure if either Q or R was false, but we know that at least one of it must be true. So, and later on, the researchers find out that either from a combination of S or non-S and Q, there follows non-P, which is not allowed by the rules of refined falsificationism. So it derives that when the new theory is rejecting T, we state that P and R, from which P was part of the hardcore, R, which was part of the protective belt of T, is now part of the hardcore of T, of the new theory T, and Q, which was part of T's protective belt, is falsificated, and in the new theory T, we add S as part of the new protective belt, like we can see here. So, maybe later on the researchers find out that either from a combination, but I think I'm completely wrong now. Yeah, sorry. So by this, Lakatos' theory uses Popper's falsificationism and implements the good parts of Kuhn's theory. It is trying to explain how scientific development is a process of different theories that follow each other in this way of succession, but without any theory really going lost and gone forever anytime. So, by using the ideas of Popper, he is able to reconstruct a history of scientific development as a continuous progressive process, where every once rejected earlier theory of the science took its part into pushing the science forward and to access its content. The hardcore is the continuous element of science. It is growing every time a science develops, and with holding the hardcore, we can save our entitlement of objectivity in scientific research. I think Lakatos' theory might be a much better interpretation of what happened with Newtonian physics and, for another example, with Lorentz contraction in the early 20th century than the story that Kuhn wants to tell us. In Einstein's theory of relativity, the Newtonian physics physics is not rejected but implemented as a special case of it. Same about the special theory of relativity. It implements the Newtonian gravitational theory and is itself implemented in the general theory of relativity as a special case of it. The Lorentz contraction maybe is to be interpreted as an auxiliary hypothesis of Newtonian physics, a part of its protective belt, and later on was implemented into the hardcore of the relativist physics. So now at the end, I hope that I could give you a small insight on my interpretation of Lakatos' work as a solution for the Kuhnian theoretical problems, and to make it understandable why, in my thoughts, Lakatos' work might be a very interesting topic to do research about. And at least I want to thank you for the attention again and the opportunity to present my thoughts here at Sao Paulo.
So thank you, Julia, for your presentation. We now will go to our question session. First of all, I would like to know if anyone in the StreamYard room has any questions.
Julia.
Yeah. So
I have a question. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give me an example of a hardcore of facts between two theories?
Between
Specific.
what theory?
What?
Between what theories? I didn't
Any
understand.
theory, any theories between T and T stroke. Any theories you can choose that. So can you give me examples of hardcore facts?
I was thinking about the parts of the Newtonian physics, the parts of the gravitational theory from Newtonian physics that are implemented now as a special case of the relativistic physics. So maybe.
But what is common there?
What do you mean?
So this hardcore effect.
Yeah. What is? Sorry, I don't get.
No. It's just I would like to hear an example from a hardcore fact between a theory.
Oh, so just like one sentence.
T-stroke. It's only that.
One sentence that is. Maybe some rule about how anything is falling on Earth. I mean, such simple facts that are implemented in.
Do you mean observation effects?
Yeah, observational effects.
Okay.
Or no, observational facts that are included into a theory, and that can be explained by the theory. So there has to be a sentence in the theory that explains how that works.
Okay.
So not a sentence like, oh, I see how my glasses are falling. Not that special sentence, but sentences that explain why it is falling when I throw it down.
Okay. I think, in fact, so because the space, so a metrical tensor, for example, in Einstein's theory, space is not homogeneous, and in Newton's theory it's homogeneous, then what would be the defects there in this field that are the hardcore? I don't see an example. As it's only that it is a doubt.
You mean in special theory, in Einstein's theory, you mean? So there we had to find out which of the sentences. Okay, now I get it. Which of the sentences are included in the hard belt? Into the hardcore.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard to state which sentence is part of the hardcore when the theory itself is just the actual theory we believe in. I think, this might be a problem about Lakatos' theory too, that mostly we can identify the hardcore and the sentences that are just included in the protective belt. We can just identify it afterwards, after we are in a new, after we have a new theory. I think that this could be a problem, of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Anyone from the StreamYard room has any more questions? So, does anyone? Okay. We have one question from the audience. Yeah.
Hey. So I have one very simple question, actually. So you kind of mentioned Lakatos in a kind of a heroic enterprise to save scientific objectivity, right?
It was just my interpretation. Yeah.
But the discussion is maybe one can reformulate the discussion by asking what scientific objectivity actually means.
Of course,
because it seems to me that Kuhn and Lakatos have very different ideas of it. And like after the publication of the Scientific Revolutions, Carnap wrote a letter to Kuhn saying that his paradigms kind of seemed a little bit like his linguistic frameworks, and that objectivity is.
Yeah, of course. This is not. Yes, I really just started to reread it again, and what I was, the thing is just that I really liked Kunns Theory because of the reasons I told at the beginning, but I have also seen the problems, and thought that, okay, with these problems, the theory couldn't work. Okay. And so I just thought when I read Lakatos the first time, this might be, I don't know it yet, it might be a solution.
Okay.
So this is just the thing. I'm not.
Okay, no, that's
course,
great.
There are a lot of differences.
And also, that's just a suggestion, but the whole issue of incommensurability and progress is later addressed by Kuhn himself in the Essential Tension.
In the what? I didn't.
No, in a book that is I think it's an arrangement of a series of interviews that he gave in papers. It's called the Essential Tension, and he addresses the problem of incommensurability, and he actually says that it has a much more specific kind of meaning.
Yeah, I just I first wanted to talk about Kuhn's answers, but then I read them again, and I just didn't think that they were good solutions, so I just cut them off.
That's great. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
So does anyone has any more questions? So can I make a quick one? Though I'm no specialist in philosophy of science, but this refined falsificationism that Lakatos is proposing implies a certain notion of progress in science, right? Yeah. And that means if we take, for example, one research camp, as for example physics, will conclude that, for instance, through Aristotelian physics, Galilean physics, Newtonian physics, and
they
Einsteinian
follow after each other, but not in the way that they follow after each other in Kuhn's view, because in Kuhn's view, they have nothing to do with each other. And from Lakatos' view, they have really much to do with each other. So the Aristotelian and the Newtonian physics, they're not gone forever. They have their part in our new theories. They're implemented, or some parts of them are implemented in the new theories.
In the hardcore.
In the hardcore. Some of them are rejected. Some of the theses are rejected, but some of the thesis sentences are implemented in the hardcore of the new theory.
Okay, so for instance, Einsteinian physics has something to do with Aristotelian physics and has implemented something.
Yeah, at least something.
Yeah, okay. And we can find something for them to communicate.
Yeah, of
okay.
course.
Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Julia.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So I would like to call Claudia Anger, who is a PhD student at the University of University of Hagen, and she'll talk about Euler-type diagrams and syllogistics, how to solve operational constraints. So, Claudia, it is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to give a remote talk in your seminar. It's about logic and especially about Euler-type diagrams, as you said. And I'm going to share my slides now.
Okay. So, Claudia, do you know how to share it in StreamYard?
I'm going to try it now.
Okay.
So
yeah, I can see it here.
Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yeah.
So Euler-type diagrams and syllogistics, how to solve operational constraints. First, I'm talking about, I'll give you some basic information. Then I'm talking about Euler's diagrams for categorical propositions, the development of syllogistics, the principles of syllogistics and problems in the diagrammatic representation, about uncertain information, about Euler's diagrams. I'll give an example, Euler's diagrams for mode Firayo. And I'm talking about Vance and Peirce modifications, visual clarity, spider diagrams, and after that, I give a short outlook. I'm speaking of Euler-type diagrams that are based on the ones which Euler used in his letters to a German princess in 1773. They work with closed curves and make assertions about concepts, classes, or sets. This lecture is about a part of my PhD thesis, Euler-type diagrams and syllogistics, as discussion of modern notations, potentials, and solution strategies. I'm working with Euler-type systems which are proven to be sound and complete, since the first was done by Eric Hammer in 1995. I present a theoretical investigation about a special problem in syllogistic reasoning, which I call the problem of uncertain information. Uncertain information is diagrammatically represented as an operational constraint of overdetermined alternatives, as Shimojima calls them. Presented is one diagrammatic solution strategy for this problem by spider diagrams. This solution provides more visual clarity. This lies in the fact that the logical relations of the represented sets or concepts can be clearly grasped. To capture this problem, I begin with the basis from which esoteric syllogistic starts. These are the categorical propositions. The categorical propositions, which are presented below as Euler used them, are represented with the square of opposition here. We can see this is the A corner, the A proposition, all A is B, And this is Euler's diagram for this proposition. Here it's the E proposition. We have no A is B, and these are Euler's diagrams for no A is B.
So, Claudia, can I interrupt you 1 second? I think you are showing the diagrams, but they are not appearing here in our screen. We can just see the PowerPoint.
The PowerPoint, yes, but there should be the square of opposition.
Yeah, we cannot see it.
You can't see the square of opposition, okay.
No.
That's a big problem now. So I have many diagrams in my representation.
Okay. So I think if you try to share specifically the document with the diagrams, perhaps we can make it work.
The document, I have it in my PowerPoint representation.
Oh, okay. We can see a PowerPoint, but we can't see the diagrams.
Okay.
So try to go forward in the PowerPoint.
Okay, I try to explain the relations in the square of opposition. We have in the A corner the proposition, the A proposition, all A is B. It's an inclusion relation where a circle with A is included in the circle of B. Then we have in the E proposition, no A is B. We have two circles with A and one with B, and it's an exclusion relation. Then we have the I proposition. Below it's some A is B. We have an intersection from the A and the B circle where A is put in the intersection of A and B. And we have a proposition, some A is not B, the O proposition, where we have an intersection 2 and the A letter is outside the intersection. Aristotle's syllogistic has changed over the centuries, and different numbers of valid syllogisms have been accepted. As is known, Aristotle explicitly developed only 3 syllogistic figures with 14 modes. He did not mention any 4th figure. However, indirectly in the Analytica Priora, he mentioned 5 syllogisms that retain their validity even if you reverse the antecedents or the conclusions. They were later named Pharpesmo and Phriseso and in Book 2, Chapter 1, Paralipton Dabitis Celantes. These modes were assigned by his successors as indirect modes of the 1st figure. Later, they were transformed into a 4th figure. This leads to 19 valid syllogisms. Euler deals with 19 modes. These schemes are as follows. So can you see now my chart with the 4 figures?
No, actually not, Claudia. We cannot see your PowerPoint moving on, going forward. So we cannot see the diagrams.
Oh, you can't see my PowerPoint going forward?
No. So here in my screen, you have your first slide with your title, the title of your presentation, and just that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So should I stop sharing and try it again?
Yeah. I think it is the best option. Yeah. So I'm seeing it here.
Again.
So I have it here on the screen. Try to change the slide. So now it is working.
Okay.
It seems.
So I'm going forward to the first diagram.
Yeah. So now we can see. All right.
Okay. Okay.
Great.
That's good. So I'm going to explain it again.
Okay.
The categorical propositions which are presented below as Euler used them are represented with a square of opposition. We have here in the A corner, the A proposition, all A is B, and Euler's diagram. In the E corner, we have the proposition no A is B, and Euler's diagrams. It's an exclusion relation for no A is B. We have here in the I corner, the I proposition, some A is B, some A is B, and we have in the O corner, the O proposition, some A is not B. It's also an intersection. So Aristotle's syllogistic has changed over the centuries, and different numbers of valid syllogisms have been accepted. As is known, Aristotle explicitly developed only 3 syllogistic figures with 14 modes. He did not mention any 4th figure. However, indirectly, in Analytica Priora, he mentioned 5 syllogisms that retain their validity even if you reverse the antecedents or the conclusions. In Book 1, Chapter 7, later they were named Phapesmo and Phriseso, and Book 2, Chapter 1, Paralipton, Dapitis, Celantes. These modes were assigned by his successors as indirect modes of the 1st figure. Later they were transformed into a 4th figure. This leads to 19 valid syllogisms. Euler deals with 19 modes. The schemes are as follows. So, can you see my chart here?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have the chart for the 1st figure, the 2nd figure, the 3rd figure, and the 4th figure. The X indicates an I, an E, an A, or an O proposition. B is the middle term. The syllogistic principles elaborated are, for example, the principle of excluded middle or the problem of uncertain information. This is diagrammatically represented as an operational constraint of overdetermined alternatives, as Shimojima calls them. He shows it for 3 premises and 4 terms, but the same is true for 2 premises and 3 terms in asatoric syllogistic. Here we have Shimojima's example. We have the first proposition, all C is B, all C is B. The second, no B is A. And the third, all A is D. And that's the same for figure 1 and figure 2 and figure 3. Uncertain here is the relation from D to B and to C. From D to B and to C. And we have 3 different diagrams for representing this example. The same problem of overdetermined alternatives arises in syllogistic reasoning. It must be emphasized that the emergence of uncertain information alone does not invalidate the mode. Key problem in syllogistics: The emergence of uncertain information, which often cannot be avoided in particular propositions, causes great difficulties in the diagrammatic representation. How can these diagrams be designed uniquely with respect to uncertain information, not losing visual clarity and still withstanding syllogistic principles? Uniqueness in the representation is important for a proof. In a valid syllogism, only the conclusion follows by logical necessity. But possible secondary information is sometimes uncertain, especially in the case of particular propositions or conclusions, and depends, among other things, on the underlying notion of quantity or concept. It is a challenge to represent uncertain information diagrammatically unambiguously as uncertain. That means it must be represented as uncertain in the respective specific compartments intersections that are concerned. For the development of some well-known logic diagrams since Euler, I give a brief overview. Between 1760 and 1762, Euler explained categorical propositions and syllogistics in letters to a German princess with the help of circles, that means circle diagrams. The categorical propositions were shown as follows. These were Euler's diagrams for categorical propositions, as we have seen above. The problem of uncertain information was already known to Euler. Thus, he has given his diagrammatic representation of mode Firayo in the first figure in 3 variants. We have mode Firayo here. We have the first proposition, no A is B, and the diagrams. We have some C is A, the diagrams for some C is A. And we have the conclusion, some C is not B. We have 3 different variants for the conclusion here. Again, we have some C is not B, and some C is not B, and some C is not B. This example describes the problem of uncertain information vividly. In Firayo, only the conclusion is determined, some C is not B. All other information about the relation of C to B is uncertain. It must be emphasized that Firayo is a valid mode. The appearance of uncertain information alone does not invalidate the mode, as mentioned above. Uncertain information can often not be avoided in syllogistics, especially in the case of particular premises or conclusions, and depends, among other things, on the underlying notion of set or concept. The question is now, how can we show uncertain information with visual clarity? For solving this problem, Wien invented the so-called primary diagrams. Wien's modification allowed to represent all possible compartments and intersections. He used shadings for empty classes, but he had no diagrammatic elements for existential import or disjunction, such as an X or a line. Venn diagrams soon become confusing if more than 3 circles terms are involved, because all intersections must be displayed. Here we have an example, Wenn's primary diagram given for mode Barbara from the first figure. We have all B is C, all B is C, all A is B, and all A is C. Peirce replaced Wenn's shadings with a circle for empty classes, a cross for existential import, and a line to express disjunction. But Peirce's diagrams become confusing too. For example, if you want to show either all A are B and some A is B, or no A is B and some B is not A. This is an example taken from the article Diagrams by Sunjo Shin, Oliver Lemon, and John Mumma. Peirce introduced a line for disjunction, but he added it to Venn diagrams. In Venn diagrams, we cannot see the inclusion or exclusion relation with visual clarity. Thus, a combination of Euler diagrams and lines for an OR relation disjunction could provide more visual clarity. The special advantage of diagrammatic systems is visual clarity. This lies in the fact that the logical relations of the represented sets or concepts can be clearly grasped, as mentioned above. In spider diagrams, see the system of Stapleton, House et al., for example, there is a possibility to visualize uncertain information as an OR relation. They can be combined with Euler, Venn, or Peirce diagrams, and usually denote an OR relation with a truth functional semantic that is true unless both of its arguments are false. So we have the relation P or Q. The relation is true unless both arguments are false. This is a good means to express disjunctive information, especially in Euler diagrams. The points that are the feet of the spider indicate the existence of an attribute described by the intersection of contours in the Euler diagram. These points can be joined together, forming a shape like a spider, and represent an OR function, also known as a logical disjunction. Going back to Euler's example, we can see three valid diagrams for the conclusion of mode Firayo. This slide I've shown before. We have mode Firayo again. No A is B, some C is A, and some C is not B. Or here, some C is not B, or some C is not B here in the third variant. Let us take conclusion C, and we can construct an OR relation with a spider. This here is spider, and the points are the feet of the spider. Thus, it becomes clear that the intersection of C and B in the conclusion has not to be an intersection. It can also be an inclusion of B and C, or an exclusion of B from C. Visual clarity should be maintained in diagrammatic systems and not be given up for better provability. Thus, solutions must be found that provide a visually unambiguous solution to uncertain information, which is a challenge. In combining Euler-type diagrams with spiders, one can maintain the advantage in visualization of inclusion and exclusion relations and extending expressive power to the OR relation. Thus, we have a way to be able to present even uncertain information clearly in the areas that are affected. In this talk, I presented one solution strategy for representing uncertain information diagrammatically. One should also think about other solutions like dashed or dotted circles for representing uncertain information. Going back to mode Firayo, only the conclusion is determined. Some C is not B. All other information about the relation of C to B is uncertain. So we have the three variants. Some C is not B, some C is not B, and some C is not B. And here we could, with dashed lines, show that this relation, the rest of the relation from C to B, is uncertain. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Claudia Anger, for your presentation. Let me just put the others on the transmission. So we'll now open a question session. And first of all, I would like to know if Stefano or Brenda have questions. So does anyone from the audience have any questions? Okay, so we have one question from Professor Ingolf Max. Yeah.
Many thanks, Claudia, for your talk. You can hear me, I hope?
Yes, I can hear you.
Maybe it's a good chance to ask the general question. Sometimes I asked Jens Lemansky, do you have some criteria for the term Venn-type diagram? So what, so to speak, the special of a Venn-type diagram? One you mentioned, for example, is a circle diagram, but also an Euler-type diagram, but also circles in the other case. So what is behind this Euler-type or Venn-type, Euler-type diagrams? What's the specificity to it? What is the characteristic of this thing, this type of diagrams against other diagrams? There are other types of diagrams.
Okay, let me go back. Yes, also I started with Euler-type diagrams, and okay, going back. Euler-type diagrams, they have this inclusion relation or exclusion relation or intersections here. And Venn-type diagrams, they have these primary diagrams. They always have all possible intersections displayed, and they have shadows in the ones which are empty. And what I was saying was that Peirce tried to improve Venn's diagrams. So he replaced Venn's shadings with a circle for empty classes, like here, and a cross for existential import, and a line to express disjunction. And what I wanted to say is we still have some sort of not really having really visual clarity if we have more than two terms. And after that, I wanted to show that we have some more visual clarity with diagrams, because they really show inclusion and exclusion relations. And combining them with spider diagrams, we can really have this OR relation with the spider here, as I showed. And so combining these Euler-type diagrams with spiders, we can try to improve them and show them with more visual clarity. So, did I answer your question?
No, my question is a very basic one, so to speak, because if you speak about, we have different types of diagrams, maybe you can also have our without circles, for example. But if you have, so to speak, this Euler type, what is, so to speak, the minimal structure of this diagram. So if you only maybe at least 2 circles in any positions, or overlapping or not overlapping, or maybe can also in this structure have 3 circles. So that's my question. This, so to speak, a kind of syntax for Euler-type diagrams in a sense. You start with very easy constructions with 2 circles, for example, with respect to categorical sentences.
Yes.
And then you put in more and more structures, so to speak. You have overlapping structures, you have main shading, you have circles, you have crosses in it, and so on. But there should be some starting point. And if you look at syllogistics, if you look at proofs, so to speak, you need at least 3 circles. So it would mean if you go from judgments or categorical sentences to inferences, to syllogisms, you need at least 3 circles.
Yes, but that depends on the systems I'm investigating. I have investigated until now the ones done by Eric Hammer, for example, or by Jem Stapleton with the spider diagrams, and they have special definitions for their elements. And I'm looking at the inference rules of each of these systems, and then I'm looking at how adequate they are for syllogistics. That depends on the system.
Okay. The other thing, maybe you can go back to your favorite slide or last slide, almost the last slide, with your uncertain cases.
You mean this one?
Yeah, this one, okay, yeah.
Or another?
No, this one's fine. Because the thing is, you can maybe also have a case that you have all A or C. It should be also possible, or not? That the circle of C is larger than the circle of A. That's another case, right?
Not in mode Furio. So this is the conclusion taken from mode Furio.
Yeah, maybe that's my problem, because it concerns your concept of uncertain situations, because usually you have put the first thing together in a kind of inference thinking, and then you can read off, so to speak, from this picture the conclusion already without applying another step, another rule or something. So you have to put things together, and the only information you get that you need some C inside A, and it gives you, of course, that the C is not in B. That's fine, that's everything. But then it's not uncertainty there because it's an inference. But if you allow any possibility, so to speak, which fits with the situation, create a new one, then there could be why you get this restriction into that situation. So do you need some more rules to get only these sub-variants, so to speak?
Yeah. That are the rules I'm looking at in the new systems. What I'm presenting here, that were the diagrams which Euler drew himself.
Okay.
And he didn't invent a system of. He just wanted to explain with circles to this German princess the syllogistic modes, and these are Euler's circles. And what I'm looking at are new systems since 1995, and they have defined their elements and they have defined their rules, inference rules, and yes, they have certain problems from system to system, and that's what I'm looking for.
That is interesting. otherwise it's difficult to understand why take only these situations, because otherwise C could be everything. It would also be fine. You need only one C inside A, and C can be a huge thing. It would be interesting to have, so to speak, some selection rules for uncertain cases. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you, Claudia, for your presentation. We'll now take a short. We'll now take a short 10 minutes break, and then we'll be back with the presentation of Stefano.
Okay. Tô.
Tá ouvindo?
Sim, agora eu tô.
Deixa eu colocar.
Colocar para apresentar aqui. Espera aí.
Tá bom.
Só um minutinho.
Não tô entendendo nada. Boa. Você sabe compartilhar, ô Stefano?
Cara, eu não estou conseguindo. Espera só um minuto. Porque eu acabei de tentar aqui e não
Você
deu. Só um
Você
minuto.
tentou através do botão apresentar lá, né?
Sim. Porque eu comecei, tentei pelo apresentar, aí apareceu. Espera aí um pouquinho, deixa eu ver se eu fecho isso aqui. Cancela. Apresentar. Aí vem slides, mas aí. Espera aí. Seu computador, vamos ver se por aqui vai. PowerPoint, é isso aqui. Ah, eu tenho que enviar o arquivo? Espera só um minuto, porque eu baixei isso aqui. Aí, agora acho que vai.
Tá.
Espera aí. Está processando aqui.
Tá bom.
Ih, caramba. Problema com seu arquivo. O arquivo está
Stefano,
aberto.
você quer tentar me mandar por e-mail?
Posso mandar. Por WhatsApp também serve?
Serve.
Tá, deixa eu ver se eu te mando aqui. Mas aí é você que vai ter que ficar passando, né?
Seria, sim.
Tá, eu vou te mandar de toda forma, mas...
Ah, o Sérgio já me mandou aqui. Não precisa me mandar.
Também. Aí como é que a gente faz? Eu vou te dando os comandos e você...
Você me fala, próximo, next.
Tá bom.
Tá bom.
Bom, vamos lá então. Aí...
Dá só um segundo, deixa eu só compartilhar aqui.
Tá.
Não, só tá processando aqui. Se der errado, a gente faz isso.
Deu certo, não?
Então, eu tô só esperando processar o arquivo aqui pelo StreamYard.
Pois é, porque eu tentei aqui no computador, aí falou que tinha um problema com o arquivo. Não entendi por quê. Só um minuto.
Vou fazer outra coisa aqui.
Talvez antivírus, talvez...
Foi. Aqui.
Espera só um minuto.
Aqui foi, o Stefano.
Oi?
Foi?
Isso.
Eu acho que você pode passar também. Tenta passar você. Dá uma olhada.
De que maneira? No teclado, não, né?
Vamos fazer assim. Você fala next e eu passo.
É, the next one, e aí você vai passando.
Então...
Tá,
Tá bom. So, welcome back. We'll now have a presentation given by Stefano Stival. He's postdoc student at PUC São Paulo, and he'll talk about the central traits of Carnap's logicism. So, Stefano, the floor is yours.
So, thanks a lot. Good afternoon. I thank your presence in my speech. So, I am afraid that the time you will be a little short for the amount of content that I have here to present, then I will try to be concise. No? And then the next one, the central traits of Carnap's, the next one. No, the central trait. What I will begin with the question. What are the central traits of Carnap's logicism, abbreviated by CL? So the first one is logic is contentless, analytic. I will try to explain that. The logical mathematical rules are conventions, that's tolerance. And classical mathematics can be interpreted in terms of logic alone. And also, every inference is deductive. Unite of science thesis of Carnap. The idea of the analyticity of logic and of classical mathematics changed over time, mainly because of the results of Gödel and Tarski that changed the face of the logic. And we can see that over the time, Carnap will try to adapt his central thesis to the new situations that came with the change in the field of logic, with the roles of semantics, and mainly with the works of Gödel and Tarski. We can go to the next slide. So, since the beginning of his work, Carnap has the tendency to treat philosophical problems as way of speaking. What means that? At the time when he wrote the Aufbau, between 22-25, there is an error in the next slide. I have put 22-26, but it's between 22-25. Carnap have written the logische Aufbau der Welt. The paradigm that he takes as logic is the logic of Russell, because although Carnap adopted the framework of the theory of logical types of Russell, simplified by the version of Ramsey, his philosophical conception is profoundly influenced by Frege's work that was his professor before the war, the First World War. And I will try to explain with the short time that I have what is this influence of Frege on Carnap also. But this tendency to speak of philosophy, philosophical systems as ways of speaking is bound with the idea that logic is neutral with respect to metaphysical convictions. With respect to the given, all the systems, idealism, realism, materialism, and so on, there are agreement, but the differences and the quarrels came only when metaphysical convictions are into play, and these metaphysical convictions we can despise. That's Carnap's position since the beginning of his work in philosophy and logic. So in the first phase of his thought, Carnap thinks that takes the theory of logical types, simplified theory of logical types, as a paradigm for logic, as I have said. And then when he came to Vienna at the end of the 20s, then his conception is changed by the problems and the quarrels in the conflicts in the field of philosophy of mathematics. namely the three major programs in the field: formalism, intuitionism, and logicism. And that makes the situation a little bit more difficult, because before this, so he had this paradigm, and he has now to explain to answer to the question, what is logic? Because that has not one answer. There is different conception of what logic is. And at the beginning of the 30s, so since his first public talks about foundations of logic and mathematics, we can see how Carnap tried to reconcile these different positions, these sometimes contradictory positions. The next slide, please. The next. So such a neutralization consisted in some form of combination of the basic ideas of each program. Carnap thought that intuitionism, the main characteristic of intuitionism is his finitistic, constructivistic tendency. And from the point of view of language, formalism has the same tendency. Then, from this point of view, we can assimilate intuitionism to formalism. And then all we must make is to fulfill the gap between formalism and logicism. So how try Carnap to make this synthesis? So he thinks that he could construct a system that will satisfy the finitistic, constructivistic requirements. And for him, at this time, logicism must all fulfill this requirement, and then complement formalism by the explication of the application of mathematics to physical or factual reality through the explication of the relationship within a formal system between analytic and synthetic sentences. No, that was Carnap's idea. The next slide, please. So that I have said already what is there. The next. So in the only one thing, still. In 1929, that's in Carnap's Nachlass, he wrote what we have as a convolute today, that is Neue Grundlegung der Logik. And there, he has tried to show that despite the differences between formalism and logicism, mainly with respect to the construction of definitions, implicit definitions in formalism and explicit definitions in logicism, we can show that all the formulas in formalism or in logicism are referred to a tautology or to the tautology, so that we have an interpretation, a logical interpretation for classical mathematics. What is the problem here? Now, Gödel's results on incompleteness of arithmetic show the insufficiency of such a picture. The main problem, of course, is the existence of undecidable sentences in many formal systems of arithmetic, such as that of Principia Mathematica and other related systems. The next, please. So then giving the impossibility to synthesizing our conceptions of logic as he has taught, firstly, consequently our conceptions on the foundations of mathematics in a single system, Carnap arrives at the major version of his conception, the principle of tolerance. So the principle of tolerance implies that, so since logic is contentless, all the logical mathematical rules are analyticals. In the first terminology, tautologos, and later he says, so I think that the thesis of logicism is that all mathematical truths are analytic in the general sense of to be based on the general laws of logic alone. And that is so, as he itself says, profoundly influenced by Frege's conception. And also, he saw that the problem of the explication of the mathematics to empirical or factual reality is an essentially a component of logicism. And then what is Carnap's solution? So we can have, generally speaking, we can have a system, a formal system, considered only from the point of view of language structures and relationships between language structures that satisfy the finitist constructivist requirement. And we can have another formal system that had a non-recursively notion of consequence and logical truth. But since they are contentless, that's a matter of decision-making, of convention. Right? What are the logical truths depends on what are the logical constants of the language. Because the logically truth, or before the semantical phase, the logically valid sentences are those sentences, those consequences, which are consequences of sentences that contains only logical constants and variables or logical variables. And the synthetic senses, on the other hand, are those sentences which have as consequences elementary sentences that are testable via experience. That's the differentiation that Carnap made. And there is differences in the semantical phase of his thought and the syntactical phase, and later in semantical phase. But essentially, the thing remains the same. We have logical constants and and descriptive constants or empirical constants. Right? And this differentiation is a matter of convention. No? And the sentences are constructed from these constants. And then all we must make is decide what are the constants that we consider logical, and what are the constants that we consider empirical or descriptive. At the beginning, so in the field of special syntax, that was not a problem, because I can decide simply what are my logical constants and what are my descriptive concepts, and then see through the consequences of the sentences constructed from these constants what is logical and what is not non-logical. The problem came when Carnap must find a criterion to distinguish between logical and descriptive in general So in the context of the general syntax, or later in the context of a general semantics. This problem is until today not solved. But next slide, please. So these are the details I will lay aside. Metaphysical convictions, what's important. Next. So, in the same phase, so the basic difference between the syntactical phase of Carnap's thought and the semantical phase, one of the main differences is that what he calls tolerance as choice of logical mathematical rules from conventions. This idea is requested in the empiricism, semantics, and ontology, when he says that the thing is what a linguistic framework we accept, and then what is logical in this phase is simply what are the analytical consequences of the acceptance of the framework as such. But essentially, his position, Carnap's position, remains the same. That's my opinion. Next slide, please. So, the 2, 3, and 4, right? The 2 was logical mathematical rules are conventions. That is tolerance. Classical mathematics can be interpreted in terms of logic alone. Every inference is deductive, unite of science. So Carnap thinks that we can give an interpretation for the classical mathematics. That's for him the thesis of logicism, and also that every inference is deductive. That's the same for example, the treatment of inductive logic, because for Carnap that's explicated by a calculus of probability, and when I have the axioms of this calculus of probability, that's a description of experience, all the inferences that we make, same thing in the calculus of probability, are the deductive inferences. Então, Carnap believes that he has found a form to solve philosophical problems by the experience of language planing, because if all that we have is a logical core, and is the same, is this logical core is contentless, then the choice between logical cores is simply that, and this logical core is the basis for a total language of science, because we can, from the logical core, through the introduction of constants that are not logical, and so to buy up the great corpus of science. And then the choice of this formal part of this logical core, he has no consequence. He must, and he cannot have consequence for the factual or real world. On this ground, on account of this, the choice is a matter of convention. That's Carnap's position. If Carnap's logicism in his combination with tolerance is tenable, then for that make no difference, the assumption of the logical core must not have consequences for the factual world. This is the condition for the maintenance of logicism and tolerance. Next. So, but then in the Schub volume, at the time of the writing of the Schub volume, Gödel wrote a paper that was not published, that he has said to Schub at the end that he would not, that he wanted not to see his paper published. And we have 80 versions of this paper. He defends that Carnap's position is incompatible with his second incompleteness theorem. And we will see how Gödel constructs that. And in the wake of Gödel's criticism, we have some important critical interpretations of Carnap's work with the intention to prove that in some form, logicism is incompatible with the principle of tolerance. The next. So, Gödel's position against the type of conventionalism and nominalism that are the words of Gödel's itself, represented by Carnap, can be summarized by the following formulations. If logical mathematical roles are conventions, then this conventionality is based on the division into the language, into the formal system between logical and descriptive constants. Logical or analytic sentences of a language are constructed from logical constants and logical variables. If the logical constants, and that is the central point of Gödel's criticism, if the logical constants from which we construct logically true sentences are determined by convention, then we need a guarantee that they do not have consequences for the factual or empirical world, as I have said. That is in this unpublished, now published and collected works, but at the time not published, is mathematics logical syntax of language. Then that's Gödel's objection. The next one, please. This evidence so that the sentences constructed only from logical constants and variables do not have empirical consequences must be given in a meta-language that's stronger or more powerful in expressive means than the object language. Specifically, the meta-language where we define the logical constants or determine what are logical constants and logical descriptive constants or non-logical constants. In the object language, we cannot have the predicates true or false, or in a strictly syntactical formulation, we cannot have expressions that are generalizations of the expressions of the object language L. Because in other case, when we don't respect it, we will have paradoxes, as the paradox of the liar. No? So the problem for Gödel is precisely the notion, the difference that we want to explain for the object language. This distinction must be presupposed in the meta language. And when we want to decide in the meta language what is the difference between logical constants that construct the logical sentences and descriptive constants, we must also in a meta language presuppose that we have this distinction and so on. Then Gödel says either a Carnap fall in an regressus in infinitum, or his argument is circular, what make his position trivial. Next one. So Goldfarb and Ricketts in 1992 in this paper, Carnap and Philosophy of Mathematics, they say that the problem with Gödel's original objection is that he presupposes that Carnap has an absolute, in the sense of non-linguistic view of empirical reality, which is by no means the case with Carnap, with the later. No? Indeed, it is undisputed, that's my opinion, that Carnap believes that the empirical part of language, our object language, descriptive constants are relative to the same language. Then, in this case, we have no problem. What are the logically valid or true sentences are simply the consequences of these sentences. That depends only of the meta language. No? What are the constants that from the meta language we decide that are logical, or what are the descriptive constants? As relativistic as this conception must be viewed, there could be no accidental non-logical consequence after that. But so that's an answer, a possible answer, but the problem is not solved, as we will see then, by the later criticism, the critical interpretations, mainly from Evert Bett in the Schub volume that inspired in Gödel's results, and also by Michael Friedman. The next slide, please. So the Bett's accusation is in Schub volume when he says that Carnap does not differentiate between, makes no precise difference between a strictly and amplified usage of the expressions in a language. So, example, if we take as meta language the natural language, the expression and so on can have different meanings. So that depends if the interlocutor in a debate is an intuitionist mathematician or a classical mathematician. So we have different interpretations of, for example, the expression and so on. And that makes the possibility of an non-standard interpretations or models of formal language via arithmetization of syntax or semantics, or arithmetization of sentences of the meta language in the language. In this make that bet to make the statement that Carnap cannot avoid mathematical intuitions, or that the role of the mathematical intuitions, the theoretical role of mathematical intuitions in the construction of formal systems, and what amounts the same to him to ontological commitments. The next slide, please. I have constructed an example that's slightly different from a Bet's example. It's a bit more simple to show what is the difficult here for Carnap. And that I read. Initially, assume that there are two people, call them Carnap and Carnap asterisk. Carnap asterisk has intuitionist beliefs, while Carnap is a classic mathematician. Let's say that Carnap asterisk doesn't know what language 2, so we have in logical syntax the book of Carnap. From the German version is from 1934, and the English version is from 1937, where Carnap, the solution for the problems in the foundations of mathematics is we can construct a language that attains the requirements of constructivist and finitist requirements, and we can have a language that is a formalization of classical mathematics. That's language 2. No, in the first we have constructive arithmetic, and in the second language we have classical mathematics and the possibility to formalize classical physics also. Then that's only to clarify what are the terms used here. Then let's say that Carnap asterisk doesn't know that language 2 is classic, and there is no such explanation in logical syntax. When he starts reading the book, Carnap asterisk finds the first explanation of point in the order of 0, 0 stroke, 0 stroke, stroke, and so on. And so on. See Logicism syntax at this original edition, page 11, and so on. So far, Carnap asterisk sees no problem, although he does ascribe the term all stroke expressions that represent the natural numbers, the meaning that it has in constructive mathematics. Yeah, Carnap's asterisk does not accept the infinite as a closed entity, but only potentially. Suppose Carnap's asterisk goes directly to read language 2, and at some point realize that some theorems are proved by reductio ad absurdum. The assumption of a mathematical theorem is rejected if this assumption leads to a contradiction. And next slide, please.
So, Stefano, can I ask you to conclude in 5 minutes, please?
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, then next.
Okay. Yeah.
My God. Carnap language 2, he can convince correct. So why can only 1 point, then you try to conclude. Why affinitist Carnap asterisk will not be convinced of the consistency of a language 2, a language that accepts a non-finitary and, in fact, a non-recursively notion of arithmetical logical consequence. The problem is the intuitionist or the constructivist mathematician only accepts numbers or entities that are constructed. And we have here the danger that the system has sentences that do not denote. And to say that a sentence that do not denote have a truth value, if he has not a truth value, to say that he is true, because to prove a theorem is to say that he is true, is false. To say that from a sentence that is neither true nor false, that is true, is false. And when a sentence that contains a name that do not denote, to say that he is true when he is false is also false. Now, at the heart of that reasoning is the assumption that the principle of tolerance does not offer us a level playground to a same level to the disputes between the choice of the language. Next slide. Next. So, how much time I have? 3 minutes?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you can take 5 more minutes.
It's okay. I think that will be not sufficient, but sorry, that's my guilty. The idea, so from this critique, is expressed also in Friedman's work that has 3 stages. I will try to be fast here. In the first version of his criticism to Carnap, Friedman says that he has, in fact, 2 conceptions of analyticity in syntax. A purely combinatorial notion of analyticity, primitive recursive arithmetic, and on the ground of the existence of non-constructive theories such as Cantor's set theory and so on, and classical mathematics, theory of numbers, he must have a relative notion of analyticity that's analytic in L. So on the ground, on account of Gödel's results, that that position is untenable, and these 2 points of view are irreconcilable, because the Carnap's dream in this interpretation was that we can have a minimal core that expresses primitive recursive arithmetic. As in this minimal core, we can describe every mathematical theory, unimportant of if this theories, how strong, how rich in means of expression this theory is. But that does not work, because for the arithmetic, primitive recursive arithmetic itself, the notion of logical consequence and logically true sentences is not effective, is not constitutive, it's non-denumerable. And then Quine's critique come into play, because that's touch the problem that Quine says we have no general criterion for analyticity, because we cannot differentiate in precise manner the difference between this what the people that construct formal theories made, and that's not more formal semantics or syntax or semantics. This is some descriptive, because that depends of the practice of the people that construct these systems, and then the differentiation between empirical or synthetical and analytical is blurred. Next. In the second stage, Friedman recognized that his mistake, because tolerance applies not only to the object language, but also to the level of the meta language. Also in the meta language, we can accept the non-constructive methods, and then through the distinctions of paragraph 50 of logical syntax, when he says that logical sentences are those which are consequences of sentences that are constructed only from logical constants and variables. That's a criterion, and then that's so Carnap doesn't fall in his first criticism. But then he says that in this case, we will not have a common play level for an intuitionist and a classical mathematician, because since we must assume the non-constructive methods of classical mathematics from the beginning, the intuitionist will be shown out of court. So in the third stage, yet I have a problem with the time, right? Then I will try to summarize that. My criticism to Friedman-Betts interpretation also is that they do not have perceived that Carnap has here a very subtle point with respect to the methodology in their relationship between meta-language and object language. All that the intuitionist mathematician and the classical mathematician must make is to give up his philosophical convictions and go to the meta language level, and then see the possibilities of interpretation, not of the object language, but of the meta language. And then in this case, the thing from assume a common language is only a practical necessity, not a theoretical necessity. It's a necessity for communication. And then at this level, we have a play level where, for example, an intuitionist mathematician and a classical mathematician can decide and see the possibilities for interpretation of the meta language and analyze the consequence of the adoption of this or that meta language for the construction of the object language as classical object language or constructive or object language that attends the constructive methods requirement. Can you go to the next? And then to the next. That's what I have said. What Carnap has in mind is two participants share the same language to communicate. That sharing the same language is a condition sine qua non for mutual understanding. This, however, in no way implies that it must be a standard interpretation. That the third stage of Friedman's argument. All that they need is match in a language at some point, but that only on account of practical necessity, not a theoretical necessity. To the next slide, please. Next. So, to my mind, mathematically, the expression of Carnap's idea can be taught as a formalized meta language with an embedded model system in which the possible meta language can be treated. Although this is not explicitly proposed by Carnap, it seems that he could have had in mind when he embarked in his subsequent work in semantics, particularly regarding his purposes with the development of model logic systems. So to see at some level the possibilities of interpretations of the meta language. Tarski has tried to solve the problem, but only his criterion is only applicable to type theory, right? According to which logical constants are those constants that denote objects in a hierarchy of types that are invariant under all possible transformations of the word onto itself. But language that Tarski considers are not language that have empirical or descriptive constants. And Tarski's solution is for pure mathematical formal systems. And on this ground, to my opinion, Carnap embarked in this attempt to construct at some level a model system where we can decide what the possible meta language in which we can interpret the examined language. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefano. So we'll now begin our question session. Does anyone has any questions? So we have one question from the audience.
So, Stefano, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Cool. So, thank you for your talk. I like it a lot. So, I have just a very, a small remark, a simple question. So, I was wondering, so you're talking about the sui generis character of the very specific character of Carnap's logicism and trying to resolve some of the criticism that he gets. But I was wondering if one cannot see an answer to the criticism that especially Everett makes and also Guido's in a kind of a similar project that has a very big influence in for Carnap in the 30s, which is Hans' Hahn interpretation of logicism. Already Hahn said that the decisions that you make between mathematical foundations are actually questions about the specific expressive power of the richness of a specific system, and he abandoned any kind of absolute foundation for that specific system and embraces a very radical kind of conventionalism that later on you can see in Carnap that takes a pragmatic undertone. So I was wondering if you have ever read anything about it and if you can see already an explanation of that kind of epistemological attitude that they have, which is extremely deflationist already in Hans Hahn.
Yeah. So the question is if we can dispense with intuition.
Yeah.
And the attempt of to find a way out for the psychologistic and metaphysical views. That was Carnap's requirement and attempt over his entire life. So, and then Gödel believed that he has found arguments against the conventionalist, what he considers the conventionalist and nominalist interpretation of mathematics, but he has not found arguments to sustain his own realist position in philosophy of mathematics. And on this ground, he could not, or don't want publish his article, his paper. But I think that from this paper from Hahn on the crisis of intuition and Carnap, the thing had changed too much, because we must accept in Hilbert's program has already collapsed, and many attempts to formalize mathematics in constructive work through constructive means have collapsed also. And Carnap must, so in some form, create all these the complexities that result from the work of Gödel and Tarski, right? Gödel's incompleteness theorems and all the consequences that Gödel draws from his results. Tarski's indefinability of truth is a much more complex context that Carnap has here.
So, any more questions? Okay, so thank you, Stefano, for your talk. And we'll now have the last talk of our day, given by Lucas Baccarat, who just posed the question. Lucas Baccarat is a PhD student at the University of Vienna, and he'll talk about Avenarius and the Vienna Circle. Tá.
Posso ler aqui e colocar?
Aham, você passa.
Hey. So thank you all very much for attending my talk, and thank you for the invitation. So I'll be talking about Neuhardt and Avenarius, especially in the context of his philosophy of mind. It is kind of a very general overview of my research, so I might not be able to get into some specific details. It will be like a very general character, but I'll be glad to answer questions afterwards. And yeah, I hope to be stoned and interrogated afterwards. That would be cool. And so the goals of my talk, first of all, I'll talk about the standard reading of the Vienna Circle physicalist philosophy of mind. I'll then go on to talk about some new interpretations of it, and I'll try to show how Avenarius is a good model for understanding Neuhardt's conception of mind, and also to somehow provides a model for reviewing the standard reading of the Vienna, especially of the physicalist philosophy of mind. So the usual story, so it goes, if you open up a textbook on the philosophy of mind, for instance, Liken's book, introductory book, or even Searle's or anything, or other papers, also in psychology, what you would find is that there is a very strict connection between verificationism and behaviorism. So the Vienna Circle, the members of the Vienna Circle required for known tautological scientific terms to have meaning corresponding to their experimental or observational conditions of their verification of the verification of their truth. And regarding psychological terms, their verification will be given in terms of behavior or behavioral dispositions. So this is what's usually taken in the philosophy of mind as the first kind of response of analytic philosophy response to the problem of metaphysical dualism, which is later on given up ever since the creation of the rise of the identity theory and the various types of functionalism. So the basic interpretation of their work was given by Putnam, which is later on copied by several different authors. According to Putnam, the Vienna Circle proposes a semantic thesis, which is somehow conciliates itself with behaviorism. The thesis would say that the Vienna positivists in their physicalist phase, about 1930s, produced a doctrine we are calling logical behaviorism, the doctrine that just as numbers are logical constructions out of sets, so mental events are logical constructions out of actual and possible behavior events. This is later on confirmed by Searle. Logical thesis about the definitions of mental concepts. The model for behaviors was one of definitional identities. Spans are dispositions to behavior in a way that triangles are three-sided playing figures. In each case, it is a matter of definition. So the relation between psychological terms and behavioral disposition is an a priori one and has an analytic, and it's a relation of analytic entailment. The logical consequence of it is that one can simply eliminate or analyze away psychological terms and treat them, exclude and explain psychological phenomena referring exclusively to behavior. So the inner phenomena would have no causal role to play or any kind of explanatory relevance to understand behavior. And also brain phenomena would be taken out of the question. So they, as for instance, Watson would say, brain phenomena can have a minor role to play in the explanation of psychological phenomena, but they do not have any, they are not an independent source for explanation of behavior. So psychology mainly leads with behavior, and the explanations of behavior are all external, and one needs to make no reference to inner states. So if you take this interpretation as being correct, then the Vienna Circle philosophy of mind would fall to the nowadays very common objections made by Putin and several other authors like Fodor and so on. Mainly those objections shows that it's possible for a person to have some kind of inner state without showing the relevant behavior corresponding to it. And the most famous formulation of such objections is the super Spartan objection of a person that can feel a lot of pain, but not show any kind of reaction to it. So not show any kind of behavior corresponding to it. And just to make it explicit one more time, the relation between psychological terms and behavioral dispositions is a relation of analytic entailment. So it's an a priori relation. So this interpretation is mostly based on Carnap's and Neuhardt's text from the 30s, especially Carnap's Psychology and the Physical Language, and Neuhardt's Empirical Psychology. This kind of interpretation, especially on Carnap's side, was recently reviewed by Sean Crawford and Thomas Zubel. The title of Sean Crawford's paper is The Myth of Logical Behaviorism, and he tries to show a series of problems with this interpretation, beginning by the fact that they're especially Putnam and later on Searle discontextualize what it means to be a translation of a psychological to a physical term in Carnap's work. Already from the Aufbau and later on throughout the 30s, Carnap has no model interpretation of what a translation should be. All that a translation requires is extensional adequacy. And he actually recognized in several letters that there is a gap between the intentional content of psychological terms and the extensional content that is eventually translated into behavioral dispositions. So this is one of the main questions that one of the main criticism that they rise up with, but you can find other different reasons that are for such a logical behaviorist is to be wrong. For instance, Carnap expressly admits for brain states to explain behavior in the Aufbau, and the translation relation between psychological phenomena and physical terms is not an a priori one, but is actually the result of an induction generalization. So it's an empirical matter whether such kind of psychological state is to be translated into a physical term. So this is another thing that they somehow don't grasp because of the lack of contextualization is that physicalism, unlike nowadays physicalism, is not to be taken as an ontological thought thesis, but it's actually a metalinguistic thesis about the nature of scientific language. So whenever Carnap require translations of psychological terms, his main goal is for psychological terms to be accounted for in an intersubjective scientific language, so that they can actually satisfy the criteria of cognitive meaning. And he never intends to somehow make a reduction of to eliminate psychological states or reduce them to some kind of a material word or anything like that. Actually, regarding materialism and spiritualism or mind-body dualism, Carnap would say that all of these disputes are only a matter of proposals, linguistic proposals, and they're in their core metaphysical, and he rejects them. So besides several arguments that one can point out in their papers, which I do in Carnap's paper, which I do not have enough time to show up because he's not the main topic of my presentation, this kind of interpretation is very close to what he himself tried to expose in several different letters. So here you have two different letters from 1934 and another one from 1935 to Neuhardt. In one of them, he's talking about his first experiences in England when he arrived in Oxford by that time. And the first one, he says he explicitly rejects the approximation between the dogmatic behaviorists and his own work, a kind of a relation that was drawn by a guy named Maurice Greenberg. And most importantly, in another letter to Neuhardt, when they are discussing some criticism that were made by Felix Kaufmann, which was a self-declared phenomenalist in the Vienna Circle, that their attempt to translate psychological terms into physical terms would amount to a straightforward rejection of any kind of psychological thought. And Carnap tried to explain to him why this is wrong, and he actually makes it very explicit to Neuhardt that he has never given up to talk any kind of talk about feelings, thinking, and so on. They all have a kind of a explanatory role to play within the unified science. Actually, he asks Neuhardt if he's not making the same thing, because some of Neuhardt's formulations are extremely careless, and Neuhardt himself answers to Carnap saying that, yeah, I use psychological terms all the time. I recently used in my protocol sentences formulation the hallucination term, so I do not want to give them up. But yeah, what about Neuhardt? So far you have a new understanding of what Carnap was doing, and that one should not understand the translation of psychological terms into physical terms as a relation of analytical attainment, but as inductive generalizations that could take brain states as a source for explanation of behavior. But what about Neuhardt? Neuhardt is much more radical in his own rhetoric. He declares himself to be a social behaviorist. Also, within the social sciences, he seems to deny a lot of interpretative and qualitative methods. He's a very ferocious critic of any kind of appeal to verstehen. So it all seems that Neuhardt was actually trying to do away with psychological terms. both in psychology and in the social sciences. But that, in my interpretation, is also not correct. And you can tell that by several different Neuhardt codes that he actually was just trying to make it explicit that you need some kind of evidential control for both the social sciences and psychology, and there are non-metaphysical interpretation, which implies a non-dualistic conception of the mind-body, metaphysical dualistic conception of the mind-body problem, or Verstehen could actually have some kind of explanatory role into the unified science. So this is a quote from 1931. In the framework of physicalism, psychology becomes a system of behaviors. So this is a careless quote from Neuhardt, sorry, in which he seems to be kind of denying any kind of appeal to inner states. So despite his careless formulation, Neuhardt expresses in several times that he does not have eliminationist intentions and that he does not reject neither the existence nor the explanatory relevance of metaphenomena. So this is a quote from a paper called Psychology and the Unified Science from 1932. Although the behaviorists make great effort to avoid all metaphysics, they nevertheless are unsure of themselves and embarrassed in certain places. They fight with all their might against inner observation, even though it is hard to see why perceptions of our stomachs or other inner structures should not in principle be just as admissible as the perception of our eyes or ears. The following sentences are equally legitimate. Carl sees a red patch. Carl senses the pressure of a weight. Carl has a stomachache. Carl feels angry. All of them can be replaced sooner or later by more precise terms of spatial temporal formulations. So it's here very clear that Neuhardt does not want to do away with any kind of talk about inner states. They do have an explanatory role to play, but they do have later on to satisfy some kind of evidential criteria. Neuhardt explicitly allow for brain states to be a source of explanation of behavior, unlike behaviorists. For instance, he says in the same paper, if we find, for instance, that the sentence Otto felt so strange yesterday is admissible in its indefiniteness and that it can perhaps be stated more precisely later on, we may mean by this that it could be replaced by a sentence containing the terms brain changes or totally body states. So here he's clearly accounting for the possibility of understanding mental terms in a functionalist way in terms of the role they play for a specific cognitive system and the brain changes that it promotes. Also in the same paper and also in various different letters that I do not have enough time to quote, he addresses the difference between behaviorism and behavioristic in the widest sense, which is just a minimal requirement for any kind of statement that is made in the unified science to be somehow controllable by empirical evidence. So that's the minimal control that he's actually requiring, which is a consequence of their metalinguistic thesis that does not imply the elimination of talk about inner states. The main goal of behavioristic is to guarantee that every statement of the unified science is formulated in such a way that it allows for intersubjective control. Intersubjective control is actually the only requirement that Neuhardt makes for something to be non-metaphysical. His whole interpretation, the core of his anti-metaphysical project is controllability. So you can see by this quote in a letter that he sent to Carnap, in which he's explaining to Carnap how does he use the word metaphysics. Thomas Kuhn recently came up with a different interpretation of Neuhardt, especially on his interpretation of methods in the social sciences. And he states something that I think really grasps Neuhardt's spirit, is that it's not that he wants to eliminate any kind of talk about inner states or any kind of Geists, but he wants to integrate Geists in a naturalistic way into the vocabulary of the unified science so that they become scientifically workable concepts. He's obviously rejecting a certain kind of interpretation of Verstehen and other kind of readings of understanding of psychological terms within the German historicist tradition, especially Zombat, Ottmar Spahn, and some other communitarists. But he's not denying that this kind of phenomena has a explanatory and causal role to play. What he really wants is to reject any kind of metaphysical dualism regarding the mind. And to understand what he's actually doing, I do believe that Avenarius is a very good model to understand it. And here, I'm not just bringing up Avenarius randomly. I believe that Neuhardt himself states that Avenarius is a model for doing philosophy in general, and especially for conceiving the problem of psychological terms and other metaphysical issues like realism and idealism and so on. Also in his dispute against Schlick, when he's talking about the impossibility, when Neuhardt rejects the possibility of a phenomenal language, he brings up Avenarius in some of his papers. So Avenarius is regularly quoted by Neuhardt as a major source of anti-metaphysical thinking. So Neuhardt actually states in a letter to Carnap, in which he's discussing Russell's book, An Inquiry into Meaning and Truth. He claims that Russell appeals to various different kinds of metaphysics, especially some kind of realism, and also an incorrect understanding of the relation between brain states and the brain. And in this letter, he clearly states that there is a pre-Avenarius philosophy or epistemology and a post-Avenarius epistemology. So I quote, I see no much positive value of Russell's book because it does not lead anybody to scientific thinking, but on the contrary to unscientific epistemology of the oldest style, behind Avenarius. You see, Duane remains the type of book. Duane had some Catholic metaphysics, according to Neuhardt. You see, Duane remains the type of book useful for scientific arguing, not Russell. He has his great merit, but just not here. In commenting a passage in which Russell states clearly that inner states are within the brain, Neuhardt also says, the story of brain in which observable phenomena happen in the brain is often told and criticized by Avenarius and others. Duplications, which is a major Avenarius term. You can discuss all of these problems without speaking of brain and then again the real question, only meaningful within a theory of absolute truth. And he also states in a paper from 1936, which is called the Encyclopedia as a Model, that the behavioristic point of view has an Avenariusian undertone. The idea of starting from ordinary statements in the observable field is, in a certain sense, the fulfillment of a program formulated by Avenarius. To choose as one point of departure the natural notion of the world, that is, the general conception formed by men who are capable of expressing it, according to him, this concept of the world is altered on the hand by psychosis and the other by philosophies. Here we have an empiricist and even quite a behavioristic point of view. And here behavioristic is to designate his own position and not behaviorism. So what to make of Avenarius? So Avenarius was a student of Wundt. He had a very close relationship with him, but he soon, ever since publication of Wundt's book in 1974, he broke up with him, and it became his own project to found a new psychology on an experimental basis. Of course, that's not such a new kind of program. And he tries to do away to found a new conception of psychology, which does away with any kind of appeal to metaphysical dualism. And he also wants to reject any kind of conception of psychology which attributes a kind of a specific property to psychological terms as if they are fundamentally different from physical terms. For him, the whole experience is somehow homogeneous. and psychology is to be viewed as a specific point of view in which we addresses the phenomena of the world. And the main core of his interpretation and his rejection of the dualist point of view is brought by his critique of introjection, which in very simple terms means that you somehow put the experience of other people within their body or within their brain. In order to reject that, he claims to take as the fundamental starting point of all epistemology what he calls the natural conception of the world, which has no kind of dualism in it. So the expression of this natural conception of the world, which is what we found whenever we have any kind of perception, or what he calls the Vorgefundene, is expressed at the very beginning of his book, The Natural World Concept, the menschliche Weltbegriff, actually, the human world conception. I, with all my thoughts and feelings, found myself in the midst of an environment. This environment was compounded from a manifold of parts, which stood to each other in a manifold of relations of dependence. To this environment belong also my fellow creatures with their manifold statements, and what they said, for the most part, stood again in a relation of dependence to the environment. For the rest, my fellow creatures spoke and acted as I did. They answered my questions as I answered theirs. They sought after the various parts of the surrounding or avoided them, changed them or sought to maintain them unchanged. And that which they did or left undone, they described with words and gave reasons and purposes for deed and omission. All this they did even as myself. Hence, I thought not, but that my fellow creatures were beings such as myself, and that I was a being such as they. Here, Avenarius somehow brings up the analogy argument, but he has a very specific twist to it, which you find out later on. So the components, the fundamental components of the Vorgefundene are the I, or that the ego, which is the name that he gives it to it later on, which is designated in his system by the letter M. The environment, and a specific part of my environment is composed by my fellow humans, which seems to have a different kind of behavior from the other objects within my environment. Besides this triad of components, within my behavior, I have a distinction between two kind of components. The first component is experience in general, which is the objects around me. And the other one is a hypothetical element, which is concerned with my fellow humans. This hypothetical element is the assumption that the movements and assertions of my fellow humans are somehow like mine. There is not merely mechanical changes, but attain some kind of they have some kind of significance to them. To not be a merely mechanical change for Avenarius means that a functional dependency is not subsumed to the principle of the conservation of energy. That's all that it means. It has no relation to abstract entities or so on. The error of introjection is related to a wrong interpretation of the analogy argument or of the hypothetical element of my environment. In such interpretation, in trying to understand the non-merely mechanical significance of the fellow human's acts, one somehow internalizes the experience within other men, as if they were not part of the Vorgefundene, but bearers of an experience of their own. Avenarius views the origin of the introjection error in a mistaken understanding of language, which also somehow anticipates much of the criticism of the Vienna Circle to psychological thought, or more precisely, in a wrong interpretation of the speech acts of my fellow humans. The introjection error, as reconstructed by Chiara Russo-Krause, which is the interpretation that I based myself in for this matter, follows from the following train of thought. 1, the statements of and movements of my fellow humans have meaning, or non-purely mechanical, express a not purely mechanical relation. This meaning must be related to what happens inside my fellow humans. My fellow humans are similar to me, therefore my movements and statements must also be related to something, to what happens inside of me. All objects primarily given in my internal sphere, which in turn is different from the intersubjective world. I only have direct access, direct and immediate access to my own representations. So here, instead of trying to read the experience of my fellow humans within the elements of my Vorgefundene, I somehow come up with a new experience within their own, and also interject my own experience within me. And then I have the problem of correlating different experience to an objective world. This is, I'll just pass by real quick. So this is Avenarius. I'll start from here. So Avenarius explained the error of interjection and all the implications of it in a passage of the menschliche Weltbegriff. Now, interjection is divided into the following moments. M, with his thoughts, moves mentally at the point of view of the individual T, in the sense of his statements. M, however, leaves the individual T, and with this, his system C. Therefore, system C is to designate actually the central nervous system of a person. Therefore, CT, in the point of view on which he stood, which is not dangerous, given that that moment takes place only mentally, thus the point of view are united mentally, and consequently also the system C of the individual T and the thought. Results somehow now the CT system has the thought. The thought is inside of the brain. This result would be sustainable only if M has not united the point of views only mentally, which means not having united them at all, or if the individual M could go to the place of the individual T without the latter having first left his. But this contradicts the experience. So what Avenarius is saying is that here you have, how can I? So here you can see that M is the individual, is the I. T is the other, my fellow humans, and R the objects of the environment. I have a very specific first personal point of view of what T is saying, and his experience is actually given by me through his behavior and the contents of his expressions, and the relation of this contents of expressions and his central nervous system states. So I can try to understand psychological phenomena of T within this Vorgefundene if I just relate the objects of R, the central nervous systems of T, and the contents of the expressions of T. The problem of interjection happens whenever I try to, as M, move into the perspective of T, whose experience is solely based on the contents of his experience and internal brain states, and somehow maintain the perspective of M at the same time. In that sense, you have two eyes within the environment, and those eyes have different experience of what R means. And that's what the interjection error makes. It creates duplications within the experience. Now you have two experiences, M experience and T experience, and they both relate to it in a different way to R. And then you have to explain how it is possible for R to be objective by both M and T. So that's what's happening here. The correct interpretation of experience would be the significative acts of my fellow humans should not be taken to express their inaccessible internal experience, which comes to surface via a kind of psychological causality. In fact, one describes regularities presented in the functional dependence that exists between such meaningful acts and the central nervous systems of my fellow humans. So the object of psychology, all that psychology does is to correlate functional dependencies between the contents of the expressions of my fellow humans, his central nervous states, and the environment, and their behavior as well. So that all that it does. And if I want to understand myself psychologically, all what I could do would be to open up somehow my skull and put up a mirror on the top of it and look how the contents of my own expressions are somehow dependent on my central nervous system. So that's what I should do. I should not read myself when I'm talking about psychology, when I'm doing psychology to myself as an I, but I should understand my own as a fellow human. I should understand myself as a fellow human. So what would a psychology without interjection be? The object of empirical psychology is every experience insofar as it's regarded as dependent on the individual in relation to whom it is an experience. So if I regard the experience in relation to the central nervous system, the expressions that the other person says, and the objects of the environment. That's all that I do. It's a purely relational thing. And I'm looking for inductive generalizations upon the constant diagnosis of such phenomena. More specifically, the process of the central nervous system, or system C in Avenarius terms, are taken to be the relevant aspects of the individual upon which the experience depends. The goal of psychology is to provide for inductive generalizations, which are the result of empirical experimentation and observation of the relations between the objects of my environment, the content of conversations of my fellow humans, and the processes occurring in his system C. Moreover, and the contents of my fellow humans in such description, whenever he's saying that he's thinking something or feeling something, is totally admissible. I'll just have to relate it to a event occurring in the certain nervous system and to the objects of the environment. Avenarius speaks freely of thoughts, feelings. And moreover, in such a triad, there is no need for the elimination of mental terms. Avenarius speaks freely of thoughts, feelings, and so on of my fellow humans as objects of my experience, because they are given to me through their behavior when related to their central nervous system. Insofar as they are taken as utterance of my fellow humans that are dependent of their central nervous system. Cerebral process for Avenarius constitute the very core of psychological investigations, and unlike behaviorists, they are taken to be a fundamental source for explanations of behavior. So Avenarius is much more close to what nowadays we would call cognitive psychology. Psychology is basically a third personal enterprise, as science in general. All I have to do is observe a third person and connect their brain states to whatever he's saying or feeling and to the objects of my environment. And this is how you do science in general. Science is a third personal enterprise. My own individual experience or my own Folgefunden is something that in my experience, I only have as a DI and no other person can have it. So this has no cognitive value. So Avenarius and Neuhardt, and here I have to summarize several different remarks because I don't have a lot of time. Avenarius seems to put forward a variation of functionalism, in which mental phenomena are understood according to the role they play in relation to the development of the central nervous system or of a cognitive system. His non-dualist conception of psychology seems to be the model for Neuhardt's idea of behavioristics, which is to correlate brain states, expressions of mental phenomena, and other objects. In the widest sense, such approach is neither behavioristic, because it allows for several different kinds that behaviorists don't allow, nor eliminativist, since it doesn't do away with any kind of mental terms, and also understands that it has some kind of role to play in explanation of behavior and so on. And also his non-dualistic kind of understanding is also the very ground of Neuhardt's understanding of a lot of different things. I would claim, I have written about it, that this kind of understanding of how experience is understood and how it works is taken by Neuhardt with a different kind of approach. Neuhardt assumes that the Folgefunden is already linguistically articulated. So there is no way of connecting something that is outside of language with language itself. And it's actually, and he complains about duplications of language in the world all the time. But I believe that a kind of a conception of subjectivity that is proposed by Avenarius is taken up by Neuhardt in a linguistic kind of form, in such a way that it accounts for his whole anti-metaphysical project. But there are also some difficulties that I still have to somehow develop and that are under development in my work. The first is that for Avenarius, the meaning of mental terms is accounted just for the correlation between them and brain states, which is not that easy. One has a lot of different things to account for, and he never provides us with a proper theory of meaning. And it's I think it's doubtful whether verificationism or Neuhardt's idea of meaning via controllability is somehow it's possible to conciliate it with such a conception of subjectivity. Neuhardt, of course, has undergone the linguistic term and tries to articulate the very basic natural conception of the word in a linguistically mediated language, which brings about some differences. In Avenarius' system, even though one can account for mental phenomena by drawing up his relations to to brain states and to behavior, psychological phenomena are caused by variations of the brain states, but they are never the cause of the variation of the brain state. So they have some kind of a epiphenomenal nature, which is not easy to somehow conciliate with functionalism. And also there is the problem of intentionality. This is a dispute within readers of Neuhardt. Avenarius clearly sees the whole experience as homogeneous, and he rejects any kind of specific property of mental phenomena. And one would have to, I have some hints about it, but one would have to somehow try to understand how, because Neuhardt was brought about in Austria and he read Höfler and he sometimes talk about intentional phenomena, but intentionality is not that easily consistent with Avenarius' conception of subjectivity. But that's a topic of a different talk. So that's what I had to talk about.
So thank you, Lucas, for the presentation.
Nice.
We'll now open a question session. So first of all, does anyone in the StreamYard room has any questions? Yeah, Brenda?
So, Baccarat, I try to understand what you're doing. For me, it's kind of a whole new perspective. But for avoid some kind of dualistic metaphysical problem, it's like they refuge themselves in language.
Not necessarily, because, I mean, Avenarius doesn't take refuge in language. What he's doing is trying to understand psychological phenomena in the terms, according to the role it plays to some kind of variation within a specific system within the certain central nervous system, and how it expressed later on into behavioral dispositions.
Okay, but eventually he tries to connect somehow this with the language or concept.
Yeah, of course, because I need the reports of my fellow humans to correlate them to the brain states in the central nervous system. Otherwise, I would not I'll not be able to do it. Even though I can somehow stimulate phenomena and somehow force a person. He talks about like pinching some kind of nerve within your ear and make you somehow hear something or express something. But reports play a major role in psychological experimentation because you need other people to talk about their own feelings and thoughts.
Yes, because when you talk about there's a slide about some kind of a story about someone from the first person point of view. It's like he understands what someone else is doing, is talking and responds, but it's because he's in a friendly environment. But perhaps if we took a person and put in a whole different environment with another language and another culture, like we can say about this.
I believe that for him, that's not a problem. What Avenarius is trying to think about is like it sounds really abstract and it may seem somehow confusing, but he's actually looking at whatever psychologists were doing within the lab at the time. When you're trying to produce psychological experiments, you try to stimulate a person to have a certain brain state and you correlate it with his reports and stuff like that. So he's saying that psychology is to obtain inductive generalizations according to this kind of experimentation. And you have to understand the other, not as a self that has his own representations within it, but all that matters is how their brain states correlates to the content of their expressions and to the other objects of the world.
Okay, but we have like a determinist point of view of like the behavior of human beings?
No, not necessarily, because he admits that they are not purely mechanical, that they are not subsumed to the law of conservation of energy. He actually says that this is a hypothetical element, but it's easier to explain behavior if you admit this hypothetical element than if you admit mechanicism throughout.
Okay, it's easy, but like how he explained, I don't know, spontaneity or something like that.
I mean, spontaneity have to be described as some kind of relation between the person's acts and his brain states and other objects in the world.
But it's kind of mechanicist.
Not necessarily, because mechanicism presupposes a certain conception of what laws are and stuff like that.
Okay, we can discuss this later. Thank you.
So, does anyone have any more questions? Okay. So I have one, actually. So I think your point with respect to Neurath is pretty clear with regards to your opposition to Putnam's and Searle's interpretation, right? And you're saying Neurath does not do away with mental terms, right? And then you propose to make a connection with Avenarius to explain how that is the case. But although it is clear in Avenarius what he's trying to do with psychology in this correlation between the three, just say realms for, because it is easier. So the reports of someone, the
changes in the certain nervous system.
Yeah, and what is the
contents of expressions of my fellow
members. Yeah. So that is clear. But in Neurath, you said, okay, we have just to, we must translate mental terms in a way that we have intersubjective control. But how is that the case? Is it by correlating also these mental terms to the central nervous system, or not?
There are two different things that one would have to address. This is not clear for the Avenarius, but for Neurath is that translations of, like, what he's trying to do is to somehow, what he's asking for, his requirement is that whenever you talk about mental phenomena, you have to correlate it to something that can produce some kind of evidence. So that's all that he's asking for. And that could be correlating it to central, like brain states and so on, and to behavior, for instance. He does admit over and over that in doing some kind of translation or trying to grasp some kind of evidential control for this kind of phenomenon, you're not grasping this kind of phenomena in its full complexity. In Avenarius, you have a way out for it, also saying that you do not grasp it in its full complexity whenever you're doing psychology, because he says the first personal experience is not an object of scientific inquiry. It may be the object of philosophical reflection, but it's a non-reductionist kind of theory as well. It does admit that first personal experience has a kind of a complexity that you cannot translate in terms of experimentation. But whenever you're doing psychology, we are not accounting for first personal experience. So that's the point.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think that's it for today. So that's the end of our third edition of our research seminars on the origins of contemporary philosophy. I would like to thank the participation of Professor Guillaume Frochette, of Professor Ingolf Max, and of all the participants, graduate students here today. I would also like to thank those watching in YouTube and here in our audience. And that's it. I hope everyone has a good day. Thank you.